The nameplate on the hearing table was simple. Black letters. White card. Nothing embellished. Chief Justice John Roberts. It rested in front of a man who never raised his voice unless it mattered, and even then, only slightly. Across from him, seated 2 chairs to the left, was Karoline Leavitt, the youngest voice in the room, the most certain. Her team had warned her this was not a fight. It was a forum, a discussion, but Karoline knew better. She had watched what happened when voices like hers were asked to discuss. What they meant was, perform, smile, deliver your talking points, then leave the room the way they expected you to enter. She had no intention of doing that. The hearing was called by a bipartisan commission to explore the constitutional limits of speech in the digital age. Everyone knew what it really was, a televised pageant of civility, where senators offered rehearsed concern and tech CEOs offered polished denial. But this time, there was a twist. The Chief Justice had agreed to appear, not to rule, not to guide, only to listen, and, if compelled, to speak. That was all he promised. He had spoken only once so far that morning. A brief greeting. No commentary. Karoline had waited her turn without expression. No fidgeting. No whispering to aides. Just stillness. When the chair finally looked her way and said, "Ms. Leavitt, you have the floor," she leaned forward and began. No theatrics. No rise in pitch. Just clarity. "Thank you." The First Amendment was not written to protect the polite. A few eyebrows raised. She continued. It was written because the founders understood something dangerous. That silence is a coward's peace, and speech, especially speech that offends, is often the only real measure of whether we are still free. Someone shifted in their seat. Karoline didn't look at them. She looked at Roberts. Directly. "I sit here not as a provocateur," she said, "but as a witness to what happens when speech makes people uncomfortable. It is labeled dangerous. Not because it incites violence, but because it defies narrative." There was no applause. No cameras zoomed in. Just the weight of her words falling into the room like stones. She turned her argument to the platforms. How terms of service had become moral codes. How algorithms were editorial decisions dressed as math. How public conversation had become curated by unelected hands. She named no names. She spoke of patterns. And then she turned again, this time toward the chief. "You've ruled on speech," she said. "You've defended it." She didn't ask a question. She didn't challenge. She invited. But Roberts gave her nothing. Not yet. Karoline closed her notes. She didn't need them anymore. She said, "If we only defend speech when it's easy, then we don't defend it. We decorate it. And when the court, when the law, begins to confuse discomfort with danger, the First Amendment becomes a theory, not a shield." Then she stopped. No closing flourish. Just stillness. The room waited. The chair gave a brief thank you and moved on to the next speaker. But the air didn't reset. Not completely. Roberts didn't move. But he was watching. Carefully. 30 minutes passed. Testimony. Questions. A mild exchange between 2 staff attorneys. Then, unexpectedly, the chair turned back. "Chief Justice Roberts," he said, "if you wish to offer comment on any remarks, the floor is yours." Roberts didn't adjust his tie. He didn't clear his throat. He simply looked up, and he looked at Karoline when he spoke. Not harshly, not dismissively, just clearly. He said, "Ms. Leavitt, the Constitution guarantees your right to speak freely. It does not entitle you to be agreed with, nor to be protected from the consequences of being wrong." No one breathed. Not out of shock, but because the room had shifted. Not from volume. From precision. Karoline's hands were folded. She didn't speak. Not yet. Because she understood what had just happened. He hadn't silenced her. He had defined her space. He had reminded the room, and her, that speech was a right. But listening was always a choice. And truth? Truth did not rise and fall with applause. It stood where it always stood, whether the room welcomed it or not. The room recovered slowly. Not because of tension, because of weight. Chief Justice Roberts hadn't raised his voice. But something in the sentence he had spoken continued to hang in the air, even as the hearing moved on. Karoline hadn't flinched. She hadn't looked down. But her silence was intentional. She was used to confrontation that came loud, emotional, layered in bias. This wasn't that. Roberts hadn't dismissed her. He had measured her and answered her with a reminder, not a rebuke. The Constitution protects your right to speak, but not your right to be agreed with, and not your right to be insulated from being wrong. Karoline sat back slightly in her chair. Her hands remained folded, but her mind was turning faster than she let on. This was not the exchange she had prepared for. There was no visible line of attack, no outrage to parry, only principle, delivered in a way that could not be spun, because it had not been aimed at her. It had been offered to the room, and that made it harder to push against. When the hearing adjourned for lunch, the voices returned. Whispers between staffers, a few clicks from reporters' keyboards. Someone from the committee walked past her and murmured, "Held your ground well." She nodded once. It wasn't comfort. It was routine. In the hallway, her aide, Reed, caught up with her. He had watched everything from the media section. "You okay?" Karoline kept walking. "Why wouldn't I be?" He said nothing. She added, "He didn't destroy me." He reminded everyone what power sounds like when it's not looking for applause. Reed looked at her sideways. "That's not what the headlines will say." Karoline smiled slightly. "They're chasing drama." He wasn't offering it. She stopped walking, then looked out a hallway window. Below them, photographers waited at the steps, the kind that didn't care about what was said, only what the expression looked like while it was being said. She asked, "Did I sound like I was trying to win?" Reed paused, then said, "You didn't sound like you needed to." She nodded once. Then, "Good. That's the only line I was writing toward." Down in the press briefing area, a different conversation had already started. A journalist asked another, "Did she lose the moment?" The reply came flat. "No." She asked a question he actually thought was worth answering. Another added, "She stood still." Most people don't know how to do that in a room like this. Roberts hadn't stayed for lunch. He had slipped out quietly, accompanied by a single aide. Someone asked him if he planned to issue a follow-up statement on the exchange. He shook his head, then said, "When clarity lands, it doesn't need repeating." In a quiet corner of the Capitol cafeteria, Karoline sat alone. No phone out, no press call scheduled, just a glass of water and the echo of a sentence that would outlast any spin. The Constitution guarantees your right to speak freely. It does not entitle you to be agreed with, nor to be protected from the consequences of being wrong. She thought about the word guarantee, how people had learned to treat it like protection, when really, it was permission, and permission always came with risk. She wasn't ashamed of what she had said, but she had learned something. She had learned how truth could sound when it didn't arrive with force, but with precision. That was what Roberts had given her. Not correction, context. He hadn't disagreed with her. He had reminded her what the ground looked like beneath the stage. And not everyone in that room knew the difference. The next morning, the headline writers did what they always do. They sharpened. They picked the loudest angle, and they missed the center. Chief Justice dismantles Leavitt in one sentence. Karoline Leavitt shut down by Roberts in cold rebuke. Young firebrand meets judicial reality check. The clips spread, but the edit was always the same. Just the line, just the moment. No build-up, no silence before, no silence after. Karoline didn't respond, not because she was avoiding it, because she knew what was happening. The moment had passed, but the noise hadn't. In her inbox, there were requests for interviews, cable shows, podcasts, a national morning program, all asking for the same thing in different words. "Come give us the drama we didn't quite catch on camera." She declined all of them. Reed asked her why. "You could reframe it," he said. "Tell the story your way." Karoline shook her head. "The people who understand what happened don't need it explained. The rest aren't listening. They're reacting." He waited, then asked, "Do you regret the question?" She looked at him. "No. I regret how many people needed it to be a fight in order to care." In a federal courthouse hundreds of miles away, a law clerk played the full hearing for a group of interns. He paused the video right after Roberts' sentence, then said, "That wasn't a shutdown. That was a boundary." One of the interns nodded. She didn't collapse. She listened. The clerk smiled. She understood something rare, that sometimes holding your posture matters more than holding your ground. Karoline returned to work. Not louder, not softer, just more precise. At a roundtable discussion 2 weeks later, she referenced the hearing without naming it. She said, "Power is clearest when it doesn't rush to defend itself." One of the other panelists, a scholar twice her age, turned toward her. "That's a careful line," Karoline said. "I had a careful teacher." Roberts hadn't spoken publicly since, but the transcript had been read in full at a constitutional law seminar in D.C. Not for debate, for reflection. The professor marked the moment with a quiet statement. This is how democracy disciplines itself, not by silencing new voices, but by reminding them what the foundation sounds like. Back in her office, Karoline reviewed testimony for an upcoming committee hearing. Reed entered with a notepad. "Just so you know, they're calling again. The networks." She looked up. "What do they want now?" "To revisit the quote. Some of them are asking if it changed your mind." She closed the folder in front of her. "No, but it made me sharpen it." He nodded, then asked, "And if they say you got destroyed?" She replied, "Then I'll let them keep chasing the sound of something breaking." She stood, picked up her notes, "And I'll keep building something quieter." The 4th week passed without fanfare. No new headlines. No trending clips. Just silence. And sometimes, that's the only space where understanding grows. Karoline traveled to a university that invited her long before the hearing ever happened. The lecture topic hadn't changed: free speech and modern governance. But the audience had. Not just students now. Professors. Journalists. Even 2 former lawmakers sat quietly in the back. The moderator introduced her gently. No build-up. No provocation. When Karoline stepped to the podium, she didn't reference the Roberts moment. She didn't need to. It was already in the room. She began. Speech doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in tension. And in that tension, we decide whether we will speak to be heard or speak to hold ourselves honest. The room was still. Not reverent. Attentive. She continued. The Constitution doesn't protect us from discomfort. It promises that discomfort will be allowed to exist, because sometimes that's where we find the limits of our assumptions. Later in the Q&A, a student asked carefully, "How did it feel in that moment?" When the Chief Justice said what he said, Karoline paused, then answered, "It felt like someone handed me the weight of what I had been asking for." The student looked puzzled. Karoline explained, "When you ask for a system to take your argument seriously, you have to be ready for the response to carry consequence." That sentence wasn't about silencing me. It was about reminding me that liberty is not an audience. It's a burden. Another student raised a hand. "Did it change your mind?" Karoline didn't blink. "It changed my posture, not my purpose." That line was quoted in 2 campus papers the next day. One ran it as a headline. The other didn't quote her at all, but wrote an editorial titled, "The right to speak is not the right to be right." Back in Washington, the conversation was quieter, but not absent. At a private judicial roundtable, a retired circuit judge brought up the hearing. He said, "She asked the right question," and he gave her the answer no one else would have had the restraint to offer. Another judge replied, "It's a rare kind of dignity, when both parties walk away changed, and neither has to say who won." That word kept coming up. Dignity. It didn't trend. It didn't sell. But it stayed. And for Karoline, it shaped the weeks that followed. She wasn't invited on the late-night shows. She wasn't booked for heated panels. But she was getting emails, not from followers, but from people she didn't know. One came from a public defender in Michigan. It read, "I don't always agree with how you see the world, but I saw the way you didn't interrupt him. I saw the way you took the moment seriously. And that reminded me why I studied law in the first place." Karoline read it twice, then closed her laptop. She didn't forward it to her staff. She didn't quote it in a post. She just let it sit. Because that was the quiet work. The work that doesn't reward volume. Just presence. The memory of the moment didn't fade. It just settled. Not in headlines. Not in trending clips. But in the space between those who speak and those who listen. A month after the hearing, Karoline was invited to speak at a judicial symposium. Not as a lawmaker, not as a legal scholar, but as a voice. One that had shown what it meant to receive a constitutional boundary and remain still inside it. The room was different this time. No cameras. No applause. Just wood paneling, notebooks, and careful attention. She stood behind the lectern, hands resting lightly on the edge. She said, "I've been asked if that sentence ended my argument. I think it started it." No one interrupted. She continued, "The right to speak is not diminished by disagreement. It is refined by it. And I would rather be measured by someone who disagrees with me honestly than praised by someone who doesn't understand the cost of expression." A retired justice nodded quietly. Across the room, a professor wrote down her words by hand. Karoline added, "We misunderstand freedom when we treat it like an echo. Freedom is an affirmation. It's space. And space means the possibility of silence." Afterward, during the reception, an appellate judge approached her. She introduced herself gently, then said, "You could have pushed back that day. You could have defended your position. But you didn't." Karoline replied, "Because he didn't challenge my right to speak. He challenged my assumption that the world owed me a reply." The judge smiled. "You've learned something most politicians never do." Karoline shook her head. "I didn't learn it. He reminded me." The judge paused, then said, "Still, you stayed still. That matters." Later that night, back in her hotel room, Karoline stood at the window. No press to brief. No spin to clean up. Just the quiet thought that maybe the most powerful thing she had done all year was not fight, but hold still. She opened her journal, not a policy binder, just a worn black notebook she carried in her bag. She wrote, "I was not corrected. I was clarified. Then, he did not try to silence me. He gave my voice a frame." That night, she slept without checking her phone, because the truth was no longer waiting to be retweeted. It had been spoken, it had been heard, and it had not needed to shout. Winter came quietly. The hearing had become a footnote in the year's news cycle, replaced by louder moments, flashier missteps, and stories that burned out as quickly as they arrived. But the sentence lingered, not because it had gone viral, but because it had gone deep. In a legal ethics seminar months later, a visiting scholar used the clip as an opening. He played the unedited segment. No highlights, no commentary, just the quiet moment when Karoline Leavitt spoke her question and Chief Justice Roberts gave his answer. The class didn't react right away. Then one student said, "He wasn't punishing her." Another added, "He was locating her." The scholar nodded. "Correct. He placed her back inside the structure she was invoking." In another city, Karoline was walking into a library where she'd been invited to speak on civic courage. No cameras, no advance press, just 30 folding chairs, 2 microphones, and a white ceramic mug of lukewarm coffee. Before the event began, the host approached her. She smiled kindly. "I saw that moment," she said. "The one with Roberts." Karoline returned the smile, but didn't reply. The woman continued, "You held it. The room, I mean. You didn't flinch. That mattered." Karoline said, "Flinching would have made it about me." The host nodded. "And it wasn't." Karoline answered, "It was about the amendment I was defending and what it costs to mean it." The event began. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was honest. And that was enough. Afterward, as people filed out, a teenager lingered near the edge of the room. She didn't introduce herself. She just said, "I don't want to be right all the time. I just want to stay whole." Karoline looked at her gently. "You already are." No handshake. No camera flash. Just a sentence given freely, just as one had once been given to her. That night, Karoline returned home to an apartment that was quieter than most people imagined. No staff. No noise. Just her, a pile of dog-eared books on the counter, and the kind of silence that didn't ask for permission. She poured a cup of tea. She sat at the table. She opened the same black notebook. And beneath the last entry, she wrote, "He didn't need to defeat me. He needed to ground me." Then, that sentence wasn't an ending. It was an invitation to grow. She closed the notebook. She didn't post it, didn't quote it, didn't turn it into a speech. Some truths aren't meant to trend. They're meant to last.